Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Phil Miller, who is a professor in animal nutrition at the University of Nebraska. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing, Laura?
Good. Glad to have you on today.
Well, thank you.
Well, before we really jump into the topic at hand, some of our listening audience may not be familiar with you or your background. And so I'd like to take a moment and just have you do a little bit of a background about yourself.
Sure. I'm here in the animal science department at the University of Nebraska, which is in Lincoln campus. I've been here now for 32 years. Doesn't seem that long, but it's been 32 years. I've got a research and teaching appointment. My teaching is animal nutrition and feeding. I also teach a graduate level nutritional energetics class, which, kind of studies nutrition and energetics. And my research has been in swine nutrition. Early on, it was grow finish, amino acids, and energy. And then over time, it transitioned into sows and longevity. And now we're pretty committed to the gut health microbiome area. So that's my academic and research background here at UNL. I'm a native of California, and I did my graduate work at UC Davis.
Very good. That's wonderful. And it's always interesting for me too to hear how people's research has changed over time.
Yeah.
And some of it does change with just the need of the industry, but it is intriguing to hear. Well, Phil, I want to really kind of jump in today with the conversation. You had talked about this opportunity to visit about this National Animal Nutrition Program. And that's something that some of our audience may not be very familiar with.
Sure.
And so let's just kind of start with, what is the National Animal Nutrition Program?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's still evolving as we speak, like anything. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time. So back 2012 is when we had those discussions about the revision and the ultimate revision of the swine NRC. And people who are familiar with the nutrient requirement series from NRC are familiar that those publications typically would have nutrient or ingredient databases or tables in them. And I was on that committee with a lot of other people who are a lot smarter than I am. But we found that we spent a lot of time recruiting information for those ingredient databases. And it was a significant amount of time. And so about that same time, there were discussions about, and it was a little prior to our study group getting together, but there was just discussions about the sustainability of the NRC series and whether they would be able to keep doing that. And it wasn't that anybody didn't want it to keep going, but at that time, funding and the mechanisms for funding were a little constraining. So Gary Cromwell and Charlotte Kirk-Bear had actually thrown out the idea of this as a possible replacement for the National Academy's activities. And in all fairness, that didn't get a lot of favorable review. But what did happen from that is that they submitted those efforts to the NRSP program, which is funded from the top of hatch money. And so I know some of the viewers don't know what hatch money, but that's the monies that predominantly go to our universities and fund a lot of our research. And so they were successful at getting funding for that project. And the core of that project looked at two aspects. One was developing ingredient databases for our species, specifically those species that were going to have nutrient requirements put together. And then there was also a modeling group of that, and that's overseen by a coordinating committee. And so over time, that's exactly what's been going on. The ingredient database for the swine was uploaded. It's now on our website, and I'll give that here in a minute, maybe when we talk more about that. But the group that I have been involved with primarily on the feed composition side, we put together the databases for the beef, the dairy, and now the poultry one it's in progress. And so the idea is that that's going to be a dynamic thing that's going to continue to grow. And so when future nutrient requirement series come to be, they won't have to spend all that time possibly putting together an ingredient database or putting together a model that's going to be used, by the users, because now all of the nutrient requirement series have models associated with them. And so we're in the third iteration of funding. So we're in year 12, 13, and it's going really well. Our website is getting a lot of use. We've entered the social media arena, and that's been really interesting. So, and it's primarily as a research supplement tool that people can use. So there's lots of good things in there.
Mm-hmm. From a nutritionist perspective, some people might be wondering, how often is this database updated? Or how are we getting the ingredient values? Where are they coming from?
That's a great question. So when the ingredient database for the swine publication was put together, that was recruited from all literature values. When beef and dairy put theirs together, those were recruited from analytical labs, and there were 4 to 6 labs that they recruited values from. And I'm probably gonna misquote these numbers, but I believe there was 1.5 million records for beef and even more for dairy. And that in the process of that, we had postdocs that were working on this project, and they were very instrumental in developing some key tools on how to sort through records, identify outliers. And so those are published, and those have been very helpful. So as far as updating anything, we've not gotten to that point yet, but you can query it, and we're just getting ready to push that out so that people can identify, what range in the protein or which range in calcium they might be looking at, or what type of ingredients, those kinds of things.
Well, I'm going to pick on you a bit because we're talking swine. Is there any opportunity or thought process that we could move towards analytical values for the swine as well, outside of the reference literature values?
I would really, really hope so. And I don't mean to discount the process, because that was the collective decision at the time. But because there's a crude protein value in a manuscript doesn't mean that an expert in crude protein necessarily did that. You can and will be able to query on whether it was literature-based or analytical lab-based. And you'll also be able to look at whether it was a wet chemistry or an NIR, indirect method. So that will be something that the user will be able to do as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my other question to this is this nutrient database, is this going to be fluid, meaning it's going to be regularly updated with values, or is this kind of like an NRC? We're going to do it once, we're going to hold those values for a period of time, and then if funding allows, redo this process?
It's a great question, and it's one we ask every month. And so,
sorry.
No, it's a really good question, because if you've followed along over the years, some of the other activities that have been providing a clearinghouse for nutrient values. They gain momentum and they get published or put on the web, and then they kind of die a slow death. Um, our intention, we've just we're almost done with the process, but we've put in for a nonprofit component of our group, in addition to hopefully continuing to receive NRSP funding. But we've been told, and the tea leaves are pretty much said this as well, is that our funding won't last forever. And most of these activities, if there's no funding, they don't go anywhere. So we've put together a nonprofit 401c that's going to be implemented here shortly, and then we're hoping can recruit sponsorship and funding from industry in order to keep everything up to date. So the idea is to continuously bring in new data, new concepts into the databases and on the modeling side as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's where some of the value lies, at least in my interest, right? So even going through previously published peer-reviewed journal articles where a diet is published, it'd be interesting to be able to see how that diet shifts and dynamics, and um, being able to use values from time. It would be interesting. Right? It's certainly one of those conversations we have regularly. Maybe not everything was published in that manuscript in terms of all the amino acids. And so it'd be
Absolutely.
interesting, right, to go back and say, well, in the 90s, these were the values, and here it is. And we can do that some today, right, with our NRC getting published every 10 years. But we also see probably in the last 15 years that some of our ingredients have changed quite a bit, and we anticipate that they're going to be changing more here in the very near future, just for manufacturing and processing
Oh,
capability.
yeah, and regional differences and those kinds of things. We've had conversations, and people have brought that to our attention. Soybeans are a good example. Where are they grown? What's the historical data? People have offered us to provide that data for us, and we said we're very thankful for that. But at this point in time, we've got to be able to know what to do with it. Just having a big repository of data is not something that, I mean, it's desirable, but you have to be able to do something with it. So we want to be able to have all that in place before we start going to recruit or ask for a lot of data. But um, variation and year-to-year variation, that's really important, and that's something that we're really interested in being able to have in there.
Mm-hmm. So that would be exciting, right? That, to me, that would be really interesting to look at those trends and patterns. But I'm that way. I like to look at those types of numbers.
Well, and if we've talked also about in the modeling group, the modeling committee has been talking about this as well, as just on the diet formulation side. Can we dovetail something in a website that would provide some rudimentary ability to formulate diets, and not to replace any software that's out there, but that's nice to be able to have your database and then import that into a feed formulation program
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and we've seen that with some of our other um, fairly recent nutrition guides. When I say fairly recent, in the last 15 years. Um, Now I'm going to stop for a moment though, because you talk about modeling, and there might be people who are listening who don't know what you're referring to when you talk about modeling, right? Because modeling can mean many different things. So when you talk about modeling in the National Animal Nutrition Program, what does this modeling look like?
Well, that's a really good question. And maybe just to back up a little bit, is that those who are familiar with the NRC, now we refer to them as the NASM publications, National Academy of Science or in Engineering and Medicine. Um, since 1980, whatever, those publications have also had a model that'll generate nutrient requirements for the user based off of inputs. And that's been done for all the species, and swine was no exception. So in the latest version of the swine NRC, there is an available download model that, based off of user inputs, starting weight, ending weight, peak amount of protein accretion, those kind of variables can be put in, and it'll generate nutrient requirements. The values that are in the current NRC are generated from the model that was done. And there was a lot of behavior analysis going to the literature and seeing if model output predicted what was in the literature that we used to determine the requirements. So that's the context of what we were referring to in the NRC realm as a model. That goes a little bit deeper in terms of what the modeling group for NANAP has been working on. They're trying to develop cross-species platforms that can be used for poultry, swine, dairy, beef. And they're also very interested in getting animal performance data that can be used with those models. We talk a lot about amino acid requirements, for example, and there's lots of literature, as you well know, out there on amino acid requirements. But some of that data you can't use in the context of developing nutrient requirements, because you don't know what, for example, the overall growth rate was, and sometimes you don't know what energy intake is. I'm just kind of blasting these off, but there's very specific ways that data needs to be collected in order to use, either to generate a model or put together nutrient requirements. And so that's one of the things that the modeling committee has been working on, in addition to discussions about updating some of these models.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Any thoughts of tying this into sustainability models and taking the inputs from this and taking them out through the outputs of the animal beyond just growth?
Absolutely. And one of the things that's really unique for this project is that we're fortunate to have administrative advisors who are experiment station directors and regional directors, and sustainability and how we um, can intertwine our efforts into that is something that's going to be very important as far as our future funding goes. So right now, I would say that the models that you see used for those that are already published don't have a big component. But Laura, I can tell you that anything that goes forward is going to have an emphasis in that area.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely. We hear more and more about it every day.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
think,
rightly so.
yeah, absolutely. And it would be unique, right, to be able to regionalize and say, well, this soybean meal has this amount of nitrogen or crude protein, and what does that look like in relationship to the animal and the outputs that come from it. And so, yeah, I think that would be a great opportunity for sure. Well, one of the other questions I should really ask for our audience who's listening is, where can we find this? If they're
Uh,
interested in this program.
it can be found at Animal Nutrition, all one word, .org. And that'll take you to the website, and it'll go through all components that are included there. It will ask for individuals to register. It's very simple. It'll take 10 seconds. The reason we do that is we like to know who's looking at it, not because we care who you are or who they are, but when you work in a funding environment, those are the kind of things people like to know. So that's the site, and then you can access the ingredient database component or the modeling side. And there's some interesting things both in the ingredient database and on the modeling side in terms of information. So, for example, Ryan Dilger is the chair of the feed composition committee now, and their committee has put together a number of educational informational items. So, for example, one's on dry matter. I mean, dry matter is something that we all strive to be able to teach and learn, and it's one of the most difficult things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, if you can describe dry matter to somebody, you're better than I am. So there's a little what they call one page, two pager thing in there that talks about dry matter, and there are other various things. They're oriented towards a general audience. You do not have to be a nutritionist to understand or appreciate what the topics are. And I would say that's also the same for the ingredient database. Some terminology might be foreign to some people, but if you want to know, for example, what's in corn, you can go and click on corn right now through the Swine ingredient catalog, and it'll tell you how much protein, calcium, phosphorus, and energy is in there. And so one of the things I've done here at Link, or I'm in the process of doing, is just generating some assignments for students in the nutrition class to learn more about ingredient composition, because as we, going down the line now, people don't know as much about ingredient composition because they're not necessarily out working with those ingredients. So that's been really helpful, because I've got students that come from urban backgrounds that are very interested in animal livestock nutrition, and they want to learn about this, and it's a great way to expose them to that.
Yeah, I really like the quick notes or quick reference pages. I think that's actually a really nice idea, particularly as you mentioned, we might have people who are on the website who may not be familiar with some of the terms, but are, curious to
Right.
know what crude
And
protein
those
is.
will toggle up when you kind of put your cursor over them too. So
Okay, so
yeah,
that's how they'll be able to
yeah.
access them. And you mentioned that there's a registration. Is there a fee associated
No,
with this
there's no
website?
fee. It's just it's and basically you maintain your identity and everything. We're not tracking anything other than where people are from and what they're accessing. We've had lots of conversations about maybe taking that a little bit further and asking a few questions, but we all know how we feel about asking questions when we're on a website. That's a real kind of turn off. And so we'll probably at some point in time see if there's a way to voluntarily get people to do that without linking their use of the website to that.
Sure, sure. Now, I also noticed on the website there's a whole tab, if you will, on peer review publications and workshops and symposium. What might they expect to see on that page?
So the publications have been from both of the committees, but the majority of those workshops have been done on the modeling side, both at the dairy science meetings and animal science meetings. Luis Tedeschi from Texas A&M University, he's a member of the modeling committee. He's been very instrumental in helping put together those workshops. The proceedings from those workshops have been published. I'm an editor for the journal. I just got notification that they're soliciting the papers from this last summer's workshop. The feed ingredient database had a symposium, and I think was it the 2019 meeting in Austin? I lose track with COVID and everything. Does that sound right?
I think so.
We had one where we brought people in and talked about non-traditional feed ingredients, those things. That's published and that's linked um, in there as well. There's data access. What was the other part you asked about initially?
Peer review publications,
Yeah,
symposia, yeah, and
yeah.
GOSA.
And
Mhm.
those are all linked there. And then I believe you can go, there's access to a YouTube channel and or some presentations. I gave a presentation at ASAS this summer um, regarding NAP and the future of nutrient requirement series. Ryan talked at poultry science meetings on some things related to NAP, and I think you can get those there. One of the real exciting things that the committee's done, and this will be the third time this coming year, is that we have put together a summit in Washington D.C. and we've taken timely topics. This year's is going to be related to sustainability and the environment and all that. And we typically put a day-long program together. Those presentations from the two previous ones can be accessed there. Well, those are designed to interact with people in DC, legislative aides, people who work with allied industries in DC. So that's been a real positive thing for the NAP.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I was not aware of that part. So that's
Well,
actually
that's we're that's the thing is sometimes people in academia don't do a really good job of getting the word out, and we're really bad at that, and so that's why we're kind of trying to embrace this social media thing, and I think we're getting some momentum on LinkedIn and Facebook, and Ryan's been along with the website developers, they've been really helpful on that. So I think that's going to be a real positive thing for us moving forward. Because I always get that from people. Oh, I didn't know you did that, or where'd that come from? Well, that it's nice that people notice that, but I don't, you don't want people out saying that to you because that just means that you're not getting it out to them.
yeah, that's
So
true. That's true.
yeah.
Well, I see our time is kind of wrapping up here, Phil. So before we jump over to our infamous questions, I really just want to remind our audience that we've been talking about a website and the National Animal Nutrition Program. And as Phil mentioned, it can be found at animalnutrition.org. And again, it covers ingredient databases for not just swine, but for dairy and beef as well as poultry, and also has some modeling capabilities. So it's a wonderful, wonderful program and sounds exciting with some potential things coming down the road that I think can be very useful for the industry in all different directions. Um, so, Phil, as we jump over, I'm going to start asking you those great three questions that we like to ask our guest speakers. The first one really is around swine resource. Do you have a favorite swine resource that you would recommend to the listeners?
Well, I'd say two. I like this website. It's not just swine, but there are swine nutrient things there. I also, because I am a nutritionist, I I use the Swine NRC latest published one a lot, and I need to clarify that just a little bit. There's, in addition to the nutrient requirements, there's some really good chapters in there that talk about energy, amino acids, and I think even if you're not a swine nutritionist or an academic person, there's lots of good information there. And one of the things I direct people to is there's a chapter on research needs. And so if you're a young scientist or a young person that's coming into the nutrition area, I'd read that chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great recommendation for sure. What about something that's maybe not pigs related? Are you reading anything today that you would recommend to our listeners?
Um, That's a good question. I thought about this, and this is going to sound crazy, but I'm rereading a book called The Fire of Life And I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's I got it around here somewhere. I can show you. It was written by Max Kleiber. Max Kleiber is one of the founding fathers of nutritional energetics. But the great thing about this book, albeit there's some equations and things in it, it's just really good to read. I mean, you can he takes energy from the standpoint of why, there were times in history where people didn't have enough energy or food to eat and they starved. And so anyway, that's what I'm reading right now. So maybe not a strong connection to other people in the audience, but if you're interested in a scientist who could write really well, Max Kleiber was that person.
Mm-hmm. No, that sounds really actually quite interesting. I've heard of Max Kleiber. I've just not heard of the book. So maybe that's
Body weight to the
some
3/4
nutrition.
power. That's Max Kleiber.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So the last question we like to ask really comes down to kind of a personal thing here. If you can think of somebody in your life that you've defined as successful, and success can look any different way you want it to be in your mind, what's a trait that that person possesses that you think has allowed them to be successful?
Well, there's several, but the one thing I think about, and I always try to mention this to my children, is that individuals who have no fear, and I don't mean that they're doing hazardous things, but would go into a new situation without any, peril or reservation, that they would put their intellectual capacities at full throttle and not worry about what's going to happen. We all have to be accountable, and we can't do anything inappropriate. But people that don't go into situations fearful, I think, have a high likelihood of being successful.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's one I haven't heard from our audience, or sorry, from our guest speakers. So that's actually a really good one. I like that one. Well, Phil, I want to thank you again for your time today. We greatly appreciate it. And again, want to thank our audience as well. So we wish you all the best.
Oh, thank you. And you too.
Thank you.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionists.com.